Okay, so this is the video that introduces topic 5.3. The Industrial Revolution begins. And the Industrial Revolution was our revolution, not in political processes like the Enlightenment was, but in economic processes. So in this concept, our essential question is to be able to identify the environmental, the social, and political factors that contributed to the start and the spread of the Industrial Revolution from 1750 to 1900. So, when we look at the tasks involved in answering this question, the very first thing is we have to define industrialization. After we get a good definition and an understanding of what industrialization was, we have to explain the factors known as the factors of production that all countries who industrialize need. And then finally, you will take this information and do an assignment to explain why England was the first to industrialize. So we begin this focusing on the economic theme. In the economic theme, what we're doing is we're identifying and describing how a society uses production, trade, to satisfy the needs and the wants of their population, and how they organize this production and how this organization affects the social, the political, and the cultural processes. So, this picture probably kind of defines what the Industrial Revolution is about. This is a estate in England called Wintonhurst that was for sale probably about 4 years ago, costing a couple $1 million. And when you look at it, you can see that it is a blend of old and new. We have the old, we have the old manor house, if you will, on top, and then below it, we've got all sorts of things that we can buy that we can use in our leisure times. You have a pool, you have a sauna, a jacuzzi, you have changing rooms, you have all the things that are needed to do the pool. You got a big old laundry room, staff quarters, and then if you don't feel like swimming, you can go to the game room or you can go to the cinema. Now, this kind of shows industrialism for two reasons. One, obviously, all of the things that are here are produced in factories. When you talk about the cars, when you talk about the washing in the dryer machines and things like that, they're produced by technology, and this technology is using also fossil fuels in the form of electricity and gasoline to power them. The other thing is the Industrial Revolution changed the culture into one of consumerism and materialism. I think this shows a great deal of materialism in that he who has the most toys at the end of their lives wins. I really would like to live there. So, our first part of our video here is going to define what industrialization is. Now, this picture basically defines industrialization. So I want you to take a couple seconds to analyze this picture and identify the definite characteristics that we're going to use to define industrialization. You can press pause now. Okay, so when we analyze this picture in terms of defining industrialization, a couple things stand out. First of all, this is a drawing from an English textiles factory. So obviously, you see the technology of the power loom being used to weave cloth. That power loom is powered by water, which from a water wheel, energy is transferred along a system of pulleys and drives the machines. Now, some other things, you see that this factory is developed so that all production takes place in the factory. And within the factory, you see the workers, and you also see the management, the dude in the hat with the beard, under one roof. So all the steps of production are done here. This picture defines industrialization. So when we define industrialization, also known as the Industrial Revolution, it's defined as the application of new technology, new methods, and new sources of power to existing systems of the production of goods in one location. So I've highlighted three important things: technology, methods, and sources of power. So when we talk about technology, we're talking about machines powered by things that take the production from human hands and put it into the machine. What this means is that the technology allows for unskilled labor to be used and also allows for much larger amounts of a good to be produced. Methods, obviously, we see the factory system that we saw in the picture before, and sources of power revolve around the use of fossil fuels. First coal, later petroleum, which is also used to produce electricity. So when we industrialize, we're basically using technology to make goods in one location called a factory, in which the technology is powered by fossil fuels. This is what the Industrial Revolution is. The Industrial Revolution started in England in the cotton textiles industry. And as a matter of fact, any state that industrializes will always industrialize in the production of textiles. Now, it has two key features. The first is mechanization. And what mechanization means, it's the application of machines and power to replace handmade goods. Finally, we have the factory system, which is another key characteristic of industrialization. And this is when workers, owners, and managers use the technology and the new sources of power to produce goods in one place. So, just to bring everything back together, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, what we're focusing on is we're focusing on this idea in which we're still producing goods, but now we're doing it in one location using technology and new sources of power. So, just to give you a hint as to how revolutionary, how did it change the processes that govern a human's life? We begin with how life was prior to the Industrial Revolution. Before 1771, all goods were handmade and were mostly produced locally. Yes, there was some trade of some raw materials and some spices, but probably about 90% of the stuff that you used and owned basically was made by hand and made locally. Usually you had maybe two outfits, maybe three if you're a little bit richer. Sometimes you didn't even have shoes. Now, when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, this is going to change. Power was provided by humans, animals, or water, and goods were produced using skill. Usually, like clothes were made by a seamstress, and so forth and so on. And that was a skill that you had to learn. People are going to live in very rural areas close to their farms and the farmland. And for the majority of the time, they really did not travel over 30 miles away from their home. Now, this was changing because of the age of exploration, but you're still talking about maybe 80% of the population that remained within 30 miles of their home for their entire life. Social classes during this time period are going to be determined by tradition and birth. So, how is this revolutionary? How did this change the processes? Well, goods are going to be produced by machine and not just produced for local consumption, but for world trade. So, because they're produced in such mass quantities, people are going to be able to afford more stuff. So, instead of two, maybe three outfits, we have multiple outfits. Power was provided by fossil fuels, first coal, and then later oil. And goods were produced by unskilled workers. Because let's face it, how much skill do you need to run a machine? Sewing, as opposed to feeding cotton into a machine, takes much more skill. People are going to begin to migrate. They first migrated to cities, and then later they travel across the world finding new economic opportunities. And finally, social classes are going to be determined simply by wealth. So when we talk about our essential question, how did environmental, social, and political factors contribute to the start and the spread of the Industrial Revolution from 1750 to 1900? The very first thing we had to do was define industrialization. And this is simply the application of new methods, new sources of power, and technology to the production of goods.